I walked into that restaurant, the scent of seared steak and warm garlic butter filling the air, my heart already lifting at the thought of seeing their reactions, of watching their faces light up when they realized what I had done for them, of feeling, just for once, like I had given them something that truly mattered. I had planned this for weeks, had carefully picked the perfect spot, had called ahead to make sure the reservations were set, had even paid in advance just so they wouldn't have to think about the cost, just so they could sit back, enjoy, and let me take care of everything. It wasn't just about the food, wasn't just about the gesture, wasn't even just about the money. I had wanted to do something special, something that made them feel valued, something that brought us together, something that showed them how much I cared. But the moment I stepped inside, the moment my eyes landed on them sitting there, already eating, already drinking, already halfway through a meal I had paid for without me, I felt something inside me shift, something cold and sharp slicing through the warmth I had carried with me all evening. They weren't waiting for me. They hadn't even thought about waiting for me. They were laughing, talking, completely at ease, completely unbothered by the fact that I hadn't even arrived yet, completely uninterested in whether or not I was part of this dinner at all. My mother sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of red wine in her hand, her jewelry catching the dim light of the chandeliers. My brother leaned back in his chair, halfway through a plate of food that had clearly been ordered long before I stepped foot in the building, and his wife, the same woman who had always made me feel like an outsider in my own family, was cutting into an expensive steak that I had paid for, laughing at something I hadn't been around to hear. I stopped a few steps from the table, my heart pounding in my ears, my stomach tightening in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. I was supposed to be happy right now, was supposed to be walking toward them with a grin on my face, was supposed to be part of this. Instead, I stood there, invisible, an afterthought, watching the people I had planned this for carry on as if I didn't even exist. It wasn't until my mother finally looked up, her gaze flicking toward me like she had just now realized I was there, that someone acknowledged my presence at all. "Oh, there you are," she said, her voice light, dismissive, as if I had been the one keeping them waiting, as if I had been the one who should feel guilty for not being on time, as if this
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
entire evening wasn't something I had orchestrated for them. I forced a smile, though I could already feel my hands curling into fists at my sides. "I thought we were all eating together," I said, keeping my voice calm, keeping the sharpness out of my tone, keeping myself from saying what I really wanted to say, because part of me was still waiting for an apology, still waiting for someone to say they hadn't meant to start without me, still waiting for someone to acknowledge that this wasn't how it was supposed to go. But instead, my mother simply waved a hand, barely looking at me as she took another sip of wine, her lips curving into something that almost resembled amusement. "We didn't think you'd mind," she said easily, as if that was supposed to be the end of the conversation, as if that was supposed to make everything better, as if that was supposed to make me okay with the fact that they had treated this dinner, my gift, my gesture, my effort, as nothing more than another meal, another night out, another moment where I simply wasn't important enough to wait for. And that was the moment something inside me snapped. It wasn't the kind of anger that explodes, that burns fast and hot, that makes you raise your voice and demand to be heard. No, this was colder, sharper, something that settled deep in my chest like ice, something that made everything clearer than it had ever been before. They didn't care. They had never cared. They had never once stopped to think about how much I did for them, how much I gave, how much I wanted to be part of this family. I could have stayed. I could have sat down, swallowed the hurt, let them pretend like nothing was wrong, let them use me the way they always had. But instead, I did the one thing they didn't expect, the one thing they never thought I'd do. I smiled. I nodded. And without another word, without another second wasted on people who had already shown me exactly what I meant to them, I turned around and walked right out the door. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my breath coming in slow, measured exhales as I tried to process what had just happened, tried to wrap my mind around the sheer audacity of it, tried to convince myself that I hadn't just imagined the way they looked at me like I was the one being unreasonable. My heart was still pounding, my stomach twisting with something that wasn't quite rage, but wasn't quite sadness either, something heavier, something colder, something that settled deep inside me like a weight I knew I'd never forget. I had planned this night so carefully, had wanted it to be special, had hoped that, for once, they would appreciate what I was doing for them, that they would see me, acknowledge me, value me the way I had always valued them. But instead, I had walked into that restaurant and found them eating, drinking, celebrating without me, as if my presence was nothing more than an afterthought, as if the very idea of waiting for me had never even crossed their minds. "We didn't think you'd mind." The words echoed in my head, circling like vultures, gnawing at the last bit of patience I had left, making my fingers itch to do something, to prove something, to make sure they understood exactly how much I did mind, exactly how much they had taken from me, exactly how much I was done letting them get away with this. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my emails until I found the confirmation from the restaurant, the one that showed the full prepayment I had made in advance, the one that had ensured they wouldn't have to spend a single dime of their own money tonight, the one that had guaranteed they could eat as much as they wanted, drink as much as they wanted, enjoy themselves as much as they wanted without a single thought of gratitude toward the person who had made it possible. My thumb hovered over the number at the bottom of the email, the customer service line for my credit card company, my mind already made up before I even had time to second-guess it. I hit dial. The line rang twice before a cheerful voice answered, some customer service representative who had no idea they were about to be part of one of the most satisfying moments of my life. "Thank you for calling Premier Credit. How can I assist you today?" I took a deep breath, steadying my voice, making sure there wasn't a single crack of hesitation. "I need to cancel a pre-authorized charge," I said, my tone calm, almost detached, almost too polite. "It was made earlier today, but I need it reversed immediately. The transaction hasn't been completed yet, correct?" A few clicks of a keyboard, a short pause, and then, "I see the charge here. It hasn't fully processed yet, so we can absolutely stop it from going through. Can I ask the reason for the cancellation?" I smiled, a slow, deliberate smile, even though they couldn't see it. "I just realized I paid for the wrong people," I said lightly, watching the restaurant entrance through my windshield, imagining the exact moment they'd realize what I had done, imagining the exact expressions on their faces when they realized that, for once, they were going to have to pay for their own indulgence. "Understood," the representative said, completely uninterested in the details of my revenge, completely unaware of the sheer satisfaction that was brewing in my chest. "The cancellation is complete. The charge will not go through, and you won't be billed for it. Is there anything else I can assist you with?" "No," I said, voice smooth, unwavering. "That was perfect. Thank you." I hung up, tossing my phone onto the passenger seat, exhaling slowly as the tension in my shoulders finally started to ease. Inside the restaurant, my family was still oblivious, still eating, still drinking, still laughing at whatever jokes they found so entertaining, still treating this night like it was just another meal, just another routine gathering where they benefited from my generosity, without so much as a second thought. But that was about to change. The first ripple of chaos would come when the waiter returned to the table, smiling politely as he placed the bill down in front of them, expecting them to take care of it as if it were just another routine payment. My mother would be the first to frown, to glance at the bill with mild confusion, to tilt her head as she muttered something about how it should already be covered. The waiter would hesitate, shift on his feet, and then explain, just as politely, just as professionally, that the payment had not gone through. And that was when the real fun would begin. My brother would pull out his phone first, his expression already darkening, his mouth pressing into a hard line as he checked his notifications, as he scrolled through his recent calls, as he realized exactly who had the power to fix this situation and exactly who had just walked out the door. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, vibrating against the dashboard, my brother's name flashing across the screen like a desperate, angry beacon. I let it ring. Let him sit in the frustration, let him feel what it was like to be ignored, let him wait the way they had made me wait outside their little dinner, wondering if I even mattered. Then, finally, just before the call went to voicemail, I picked up, pressing the phone to my ear, waiting just long enough for him to spit out the first words, his voice sharp, furious, barely controlled. "What the hell did you do?" I didn't answer right away, Didn't bother to pretend like I didn't know what he was talking about. Didn't even try to suppress the satisfaction curling through my chest as I imagined their faces, as I imagined the panic setting in, as I imagined the sheer, delicious horror of realizing they actually had to pay for their own meal. "Enjoy the bill," I said simply, and then, before he could get another word in, before he could argue or plead or demand, I hung up. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror for a long moment, taking in the way my expression had shifted, the way my eyes seemed sharper, the way I felt lighter than I had in years. They had thought I wouldn't mind. They had thought I would just accept it. They had thought they could keep taking and taking without consequence.
But now?
Now, they were going to learn exactly what it felt like to handle things on their own. Let's see how they handled paying their own way for once. The next morning, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree, notification after notification flooding the screen, my family's names stacked on top of each other in an endless stream of unread messages, each one more desperate and furious than the last. I didn't even have to open them to know exactly what they said. Didn't need to read a single word to hear my mother's exasperated tone, my brother's angry disbelief, my sister-in-law's passive-aggressive judgment disguised as concern. They were predictable, so painfully predictable, the same cycle of entitlement and outrage, the same self-centered indignation, the same refusal to acknowledge why I had done what I did, the same refusal to see themselves as anything other than victims of my so-called selfishness. The first message was from my mother, long and dramatic, full of unnecessary capital letters and exclamation points, the kind of text that read like a lecture, like a scolding, like a reminder that in her mind, she was the authority and I was just some ungrateful child acting out of turn. "I cannot believe you did this to your family. We were embarrassed. Do you know how humiliating it was? Everyone was staring at us. How could you do this over something so small? Something so small." I scoffed, shaking my head, barely suppressing the bitter laugh that bubbled up in my throat, because of course that's how she saw it. Of course that's what she reduced it to. Of course, she wasn't angry about what they did. She was angry that I reacted to it. It didn't matter that they had dismissed me, ignored me, left me out of my own gift, treated me like an afterthought in my own kindness. No, what mattered was that I had refused to accept it, that I had dared to inconvenience them, that I had forced them to face the reality of their own selfishness, even if just for one uncomfortable, humiliating night. My brother's messages were just as predictable, filled with rage and entitlement, full of insults that barely masked his bruised ego, full of the kind of arrogant frustration that only comes from someone who had spent his entire life believing that he was always going to come out on top. "Are you serious? You made us look like idiots. Do you even realize how much money that bill was? Your lucky mom covered most of it, but I had to put down my own card. I shouldn't have had to do that, and you know it. I shouldn't have had to do that." As if he hadn't been fully prepared to sit there, eating and drinking without a care in the world, knowing that I was footing the bill, knowing that I had planned this entire evening, knowing that I had paid in advance just to make sure they didn't have to think about anything other than enjoying themselves. But the second things didn't go his way, the second he had to take even a fraction of responsibility for the dinner, the second he had to reach into his own pocket for once, suddenly I was the villain, I was the selfish one, I was the problem. And then there was my sister-in-law, who always had a special way of making every situation worse, who had perfected the art of pretending to be neutral while twisting the knife in the most condescending way possible. "I don't know why you're being like this, but you really hurt your mom. She was so upset when we got home. I get that you were annoyed, but was it really worth making a scene over a dinner? We're family. Family forgives. Family forgives." That was the part that got me the most. That was the part that made my fingers tighten around my phone. That was the part that nearly sent me over the edge. Because wasn't that exactly what I had been doing all these years? Forgiving them? Over and over again, brushing off the way they overlooked me, excusing the way they took my kindness without a second thought, letting go of the way they always assumed I would just be there, that I would always take care of things, that I would always give without expecting anything in return. Hadn't I been forgiving them every time they forgot my birthday but expected me to plan theirs? Every time they borrowed money and never paid me back? Every time they made me feel like I was just the extra in their perfect little family picture? I locked my phone without responding, letting their messages sit there, unanswered, unopened, unread. Let them stew. Let them wonder. Let them sit in the discomfort for once instead of forcing me to swallow it down, instead of making me the one who had to smooth things over, instead of expecting me to fix the situation like I had been doing my entire life. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel guilty. Instead, I let myself remember. I let myself think about every holiday where I spent hours cooking while they barely said thank you, every favor they asked for while pretending it was no big deal, every time I had gone out of my way to be there for them only to realize, in the moments I needed them, that I was always alone. I thought about all the times I had let things slide, had convinced myself that maybe they just didn't realize what they were doing, had told myself maybe next time would be different. But next time never came. They had never changed. They were never going to change. And I was finally done pretending they would. I knew my father had seen the messages, knew he had been on that group chat, knew he had read every single thing they said to me. But he hadn't texted me. He hadn't called. He hadn't even tried to reach out, and I couldn't tell if that meant he understood why I did it, or if he just didn't want to get involved, or if he had spent so many years keeping his head down and staying out of the way that he had forgotten what it meant to stand up for someone. It didn't matter, because I wasn't looking for an apology anymore. I wasn't waiting for them to understand. I wasn't hoping they would suddenly see my worth. I had spent my entire life making things easy for them, making things comfortable, making things simple, making sure they never had to feel the things I had felt, making sure they never had to sit in the cold silence of being left out. But this time, they were the ones feeling it. They thought I was just being dramatic. They had no idea what was coming next. I heard the knock before I even had a chance to finish my morning coffee, a sharp, impatient rhythm against my front door that told me exactly who it was before I even looked through the peephole. My mother had never been the type to wait, never been the type to ask for things when she could simply demand them, never been the type to consider whether or not her presence was welcome. If she wanted something, if she had something to say, if she needed to remind me of my place, she showed up uninvited, just like she was doing now. I sighed, setting my mug down on the counter, glancing at my phone where the unread messages from my family still sat untouched, their words buzzing with misplaced anger, their entitlement practically oozing through the screen. I had ignored them all night, ignored the calls, ignored the guilt-laced voicemails, ignored the increasingly aggressive texts, knowing that any response, any acknowledgement, would only make it worse. And now, standing on the other side of my door, was the woman who had taught them exactly how to be this way. I debated not answering, debated letting her stand there, knocking until she gave up, but I knew my mother. She wasn't the kind of woman who gave up easily, wasn't the kind of woman who let people ignore her, wasn't the kind of woman who would walk away just because I wanted her to. So, with a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pulled it open, bracing myself for whatever self-righteous speech she had prepared. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, didn't bother pretending she was here for any reason other than to scold me, didn't even pretend she was interested in hearing my side of things. Instead, she crossed her arms, narrowed her eyes, and let out a sharp breath, like she couldn't believe she had to be here dealing with my nonsense. "It was just a meal," she said, her tone clipped, her expression full of disbelief, as if she still couldn't wrap her head around the fact that I had dared to stand up for myself. "I don't understand why you're being so childish about this." I let out a slow breath, fighting the urge to laugh, fighting the urge to yell, fighting the urge to ask her if she had even heard herself, if she had even stopped to think about how ridiculous she sounded, about how absurd it was to reduce everything to just a meal. Because it had never been about the meal. It had never been about one dinner. It had never been about one night. "It wasn't just a meal," I said, keeping my voice steady, keeping my expression neutral, refusing to let her see even a flicker of emotion, refusing to give her anything she could use against me. "It was a pattern." She blinked, her mouth tightening, her shoulders squaring as if preparing for a fight, as if she had expected me to fold, as if she had walked in here assuming that I would back down the way I always had, that I would let her talk me into guilt, that I would let her twist the situation into something that made me the problem. "Oh, for God's sake," she scoffed, rolling her eyes like I was some irrational child, like I was making up the very things I had spent a lifetime feeling. You're blowing this completely out of proportion. We didn't wait a few extra minutes for you, and suddenly, you're acting like we don't love you." I didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't let the words sink in the way she wanted them to, didn't let her rewrite reality with the same practiced ease she always had, didn't let her turn their neglect into my overreaction. "It was never just about waiting," I said, my voice still calm, still controlled, but sharper now, firmer, full of something she wasn't used to hearing from me: certainty. "It was about the fact that you never even thought about waiting. It was about the fact that it didn't even occur to you that I was supposed to be part of that dinner. It was about the fact that I was the one who planned it, paid for it, made it possible, and you still treated me like I didn't matter." Her jaw tightened, her fingers curling slightly against her arms, her stance shifting, like she was trying to find another angle, another way to turn this back on me, another way to convince herself that she was still in control. "You're being ridiculous," she said finally, shaking her head, dismissing my words with a wave of her hand, like she could physically erase them, like she could make them untrue just by refusing to acknowledge them. "Family always helps family. You were supposed to pay anyway." And there it was. The truth beneath everything, the reality she had never admitted outright, the belief that had been sitting beneath the surface for years, the quiet, unspoken expectation that had followed me for as long as I could remember. It had never been about appreciation, had never been about love, had never been about anything other than what I could do for them. I had been their safety net, their provider, their backup plan, the one who always made sure things got done, the one who always took care of things, the one who always handled whatever they couldn't be bothered to deal with. And they had never seen it as kindness, had never seen it as generosity, had never even considered that maybe I wanted to be treated as more than just a walking credit card. This was never about love. It was always about control. I exhaled slowly, tilting my head slightly, studying her, really seeing her for the first time, really recognizing who she was, really understanding that there was no amount of explaining, no amount of reasoning, no amount of conversation that would make her see what she had done wrong. She didn't think she had done anything wrong. She never would. "You're right," I said finally, watching the flicker of satisfaction cross her face, the brief moment where she thought she had won, where she thought she had gotten through to me. And then I smiled. "Family helps family," I echoed, my voice light, amused, something dangerous curling behind it, something she had never heard from me before. "So, it's about time you learned how to help yourselves." Her expression shifted, her mouth opening like she was about to argue, like she was about to tell me that I didn't get to do this, that I didn't get to walk away from them, that I didn't get to set the rules. But I was already closing the door. If they wanted to use me, they'd have to learn the hard way that I was done playing along. For years, I had been the one who covered the gaps, the one who made sure birthdays didn't go uncelebrated, that unexpected bills got paid, that expensive holiday dinners were handled without argument, that family vacations were made possible even when no one else could afford them. It had never been a conversation, never been a request, never been something anyone asked if I could do. It was just expected. I had allowed it to happen, had let them take from me without pushing back, had convinced myself that it was just what family did because every time I had hesitated, every time I had even thought about setting boundaries, I had been met with the same rehearsed guilt, the same carefully placed words, the same reminders that I was doing well and that helping out was just part of being a good daughter, a good sister, a good person. But this time, I wasn't playing along. The fallout from the restaurant incident had settled like a storm cloud over the family, heavy and unrelenting, thick with unspoken resentment, with quiet anger, with a kind of tension that made every interaction feel like walking across a frozen lake, waiting for the ice to crack beneath my feet. My mother had cooled down just enough to stop showing up unannounced, but she still sent the occasional passive-aggressive text, the kind that pretended to be concerned while barely concealing her disappointment. My sister-in-law had taken the mature route and gone completely silent, which was honestly a blessing, given how exhausting it was to listen to her pretend to be above it all. And my brother? My brother was furious. I had known he would be, had expected the moment he would come storming into my life, demanding answers, demanding to know why I was acting this way, demanding to know why I was being so selfish all of a sudden. What I hadn't expected What I hadn't fully prepared for was how much I would enjoy watching him realize, in real time, that his free ride was finally over. It happened 2 weeks after the dinner, on a Sunday afternoon, when my phone rang for the first time in days, and I saw my brother's name flashing across the screen. I debated ignoring it, debated letting him stew the way I had let the rest of them, debated forcing him to wait the way they had made me wait outside that restaurant, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want, Ethan?" I said as soon as I picked up, skipping the pleasantries, skipping the small talk, skipping the how are you that neither of us actually cared about. "I need a favor," he said, his voice tight, his tone already carrying that edge that told me he was expecting an argument, expecting resistance, expecting me to fight him on this. "I need to borrow some money. It's just a short-term thing. I'll pay you back by next month." I almost laughed, almost let out a full, unrestrained laugh at the sheer audacity of it, at the way he spoke as if the last few weeks hadn't happened, as if nothing had changed, as if I was still the same person who would just nod and say sure. "How much?" Without even thinking about it. "No," I said simply, because there was no need to argue, no need to explain, no need to justify myself to a man who had never once justified taking from me. There was a pause, a sharp inhale, a silence that stretched for just long enough to tell me he hadn't expected me to say no outright. He had expected resistance, sure, had prepared for a conversation, for a debate, for a chance to talk me into it, but he hadn't expected me to shut him down without hesitation. "What do you mean, no?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief, as if the concept was foreign to him, as if I was the one being unreasonable, as if I was the one who had just broken some unspoken rule. "I mean no," I repeated, keeping my voice steady, keeping my tone calm, keeping my satisfaction carefully masked beneath indifference. "I'm done helping out. No more money, no more favors, no more paying for things just because no one else wants to. Figure it out yourself." "Are you serious?" he snapped, his patience unraveling, his frustration finally breaking through the last remnants of forced civility. "Since when do you not help your own family?" "Since my family made it clear I didn't matter." I shot back, letting the words land, letting them sit there, letting him feel them the way I had felt them that night at the restaurant, the way I had felt them every time they had taken from me, without a second thought. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh, one of those disbelieving scoffs that men like him used when they were losing control of a situation. "This is about that stupid dinner? Jesus, I knew you were being dramatic, but this is insane." "You didn't think I'd mind," I said, my voice soft, deliberate, repeating the exact words my mother had thrown at me, the exact excuse they had used to justify leaving me out of my own dinner, the exact phrase that had flipped a switch in my brain and made me realize how little I actually meant to them. There was another pause, another sharp inhale, another moment where I knew he was about to explode, about to let out all the frustration that had been bubbling beneath the surface since the second he realized I was serious. "You're being a bitch, you know that," he spat, his words dripping with anger, with resentment, with the kind of venom that only comes from someone who has never had to hear the word no before. "You can't just cut us off like this. Family doesn't do that." I smiled, slow and satisfied, because he still didn't get it, still didn't understand that I wasn't asking for his approval, wasn't interested in his acceptance, wasn't concerned with whether or not he thought I was allowed to do this. "Harsh," I repeated, letting the amusement seep into my voice, letting him hear how little his words affected me.
"No."
"Harsh would have been leaving you all with the dishes." He cursed under his breath, muttered something about how I'd regret this, something about how I was going to ruin our family, something about how I was just bitter and selfish and pathetic. But I didn't hear the rest, didn't care enough to listen, didn't waste another second of my time, because I had already hung up. They thought I was joking. They'd learn soon enough. The silence from my family lasted for almost a full week, a record in itself, a stretch of time so unusual that I actually started to enjoy it, actually started to breathe without the weight of their expectations pressing down on me, actually started to feel the kind of peace that came from knowing that, for once, no one was about to call me with a problem they wanted me to fix, a bill they expected me to pay, or a favor they had no intention of repaying. But I knew it wouldn't last, knew that the quiet was nothing more than the calm before the inevitable storm, knew that sooner or later, they would come crawling back, not because they had suddenly realized they were wrong, not because they had taken the time to reflect, not because they had even considered apologizing, but because they needed something. And sure enough, the first call came just as I was starting to think they might actually leave me alone. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed, my brother's name flashing across the screen, his number standing out in stark contrast against the silence that had filled the last few days. I didn't answer right away, didn't even want to answer, but curiosity got the better of me. The part of me that wanted to know just how long it had taken for reality to finally hit him, the part of me that wanted to hear, with my own ears, just how desperate he had become now that he could no longer rely on me to bail him out. "Let me guess," I said as soon as I picked up, skipping the pleasantries, skipping the small talk, skipping the fake concern. "You need money." There was a pause, just a second too long, the kind of hesitation that told me he hadn't expected me to say it outright, that he had probably planned to ease into the conversation, to start with something friendly, to act like we were just two siblings catching up instead of two people who were about to have a conversation neither of us wanted to have. "It's just temporary," he said finally, his voice strained, his patience already thin, his frustration already simmering beneath the surface. "I just need help with my car payment this month." I had everything covered, but then some unexpected expenses came up, and I figured. "You figured I'd cover it," I interrupted, finishing the sentence for him, saying it for what it was instead of what he wanted it to be, refusing to let him dress it up as something reasonable, something casual, something that I should obviously say yes to just because he had gotten used to me always saying yes. "It's not a big deal," he snapped, his patience already cracking, his entitlement bleeding through, his voice carrying that edge that told me he was still convinced that if he just pushed hard enough, if he just talked long enough, if he just wore me down, I would cave the way I always had. "It's not like you can't afford it. I just need a little help and then I'll be fine." "And what if I say no?" I asked, my voice calm, my tone steady, my heart hammering in my chest because I already knew the answer, because I already knew what would happen next, because I had spent my entire life watching my brother react when things didn't go his way. And, just like clockwork, just like every single time before this, he lost it. "Jesus Christ, you're so goddamn selfish," he exploded, his voice sharp, angry, full of that familiar frustration, full of that old resentment, full of that ugly, childish anger that only ever came out when he realized he wasn't getting what he wanted. "I don't ask you for much, okay? I don't call you all the time begging for money. I don't make you do things for me every single day, but the one time I need something, you're acting like it's some huge deal." I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, let the words wash over me, let the anger roll off me the way I had never been able to before, let the insults fall flat against the wall I had spent the last few weeks building around myself. Because the truth was, I had heard it all before, had listened to this exact speech more times than I could count, had spent years buying into it, had spent years believing that maybe he was right, that maybe I was being unfair, that maybe I owed them something just because they had decided that I did. But this time, I didn't care. "You're a grown man, Ethan," I said finally, my voice light, my tone almost bored, my patience long gone. "Figure it out yourself." "Wow," he scoffed, his breath coming out in a sharp, humorless laugh, the kind of sound that made it clear he wasn't used to being denied, that he wasn't used to hearing no, that he still, even now, even after everything, thought I would change my mind. "You really think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" "No," I said simply, letting the finality of the word settle between us, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to realize that I wasn't going to argue, that I wasn't going to justify myself, that I wasn't going to play this game anymore. And then, just like that, I hung up. The next day, my mother called, her voice softer than it had been in weeks, her words carefully chosen, her tone carrying that sickly sweet kindness that she only ever used when she wanted something. She asked how I was, asked if I had been busy lately, asked if I was feeling better about everything that had happened. And when I didn't respond, when I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to get to the point, she finally sighed and said, "Look, I know things have been tense, but can't we just move past this? We're family, sweetheart. And family takes care of each other." I smiled to myself, shaking my head, because I knew what she meant, because I knew she wasn't saying it out of love, because I knew she wasn't really trying to fix things. She was just trying to fix her situation. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice smooth, easy, unwavering. "Family takes care of each other. So maybe it's time you all learn how to take care of yourselves." For the first time, they had to stand on their own. And they hated it. It started with one missed call, then another, my phone vibrating insistently on the kitchen counter as I stood there, staring at it, watching my brother's name flash across the screen like some desperate warning, like some final attempt to pull me back into the life I had spent the last few weeks untangling myself from. I didn't answer right away, didn't even reach for the phone, didn't feel the usual pull of obligation, the usual instinct to fix whatever disaster had finally forced him to swallow his pride and call me. Instead, I just waited, just let him keep calling, let him sit in his own panic, let him need me for once without the guarantee that I would come running. By the time I finally answered, his frustration was already simmering beneath the surface, barely restrained, his words sharp and clipped, his tone a mix of desperation and bitterness, like he still couldn't decide if he wanted to beg or yell. "Are you seriously going to ignore me right now?" he snapped, skipping any kind of greeting, skipping any kind of pretense, jumping straight into the fight he had clearly been rehearsing in his head. "I've been trying to call you all day." "I noticed," I said, keeping my voice flat, uninterested, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted, refusing to let him control the conversation the way he always tried to. There was a pause, just long enough for him to realize I wasn't going to ask what was wrong, wasn't going to make this easier, wasn't going to give him an opening to twist the conversation in his favor. "I need help," he finally admitted, and just like that, the mask slipped, the frustration faded, the anger drained out of his voice, leaving nothing but panic, nothing but helplessness, nothing but the weight of someone who had finally run out of options. "I'm in trouble, and I don't have anyone else to call." I should have felt something then, should have felt pity or concern, or maybe even some small flicker of satisfaction at the fact that he was finally feeling what it was like to have nowhere to turn, to have no one to lean on, to be left standing alone after years of assuming he would always have a safety net. But all I felt was tired, all I felt was empty, all I felt was a dull sense of inevitability, like I had known this moment was coming, like I had been waiting for the exact second when he would come crawling back, expecting me to patch up his life the way I had always done before. "What kind of trouble?" I asked, not because I planned on fixing it, not because I was even tempted to, but because I wanted to hear him say it, wanted to hear him admit that after all his yelling, after all his insults, after all his tantrums about how I was selfish and unfair, he still needed me. "The bank denied my extension on the loan," he muttered, his voice tight, his words forced, like he hated having to explain this, hated having to admit that he wasn't as invincible as he pretended to be. "I thought I'd have more time, but they're saying I have to pay in full by the end of the month, or they're going to start collections." I almost laughed, almost let out a sharp, bitter laugh at the sheer audacity of it, at the way he still, even now, even after everything, thought this conversation was leading somewhere other than me handing him money. "That sounds rough," I said instead, keeping my voice neutral, making sure there wasn't a single hint of sympathy in my tone. "I hope you figure it out." "Are you kidding me?" he snapped, and just like that, the act was gone, the helpless little brother routine disappearing as fast as it had come, the anger creeping back in, the entitlement bleeding through every syllable. "You're really going to let me drown over a few $1,000s? You could help me right now, and not even miss it." "And yet," I said, my voice steady, "I don't feel like helping you at all." Silence. And then, in the background, another voice, softer but no less desperate, no less manipulative, no less calculated. "Sweetheart, please." My mother's voice broke through the speaker, her tone carrying the exact same carefully crafted sadness she had used on me every time she wanted something. "I know you're upset, I know you're hurt, but this is your brother. He's family, and family forgives." "Forgiveness isn't the problem," I said, feeling something inside me harden, something inside me close off completely, something inside me let go of whatever last shred of patience I might have still had. "You want me to forget, not forgive." You want me to pretend like nothing happened, like I don't know exactly what you all think of me, like I don't remember the way you made me feel that night. But I do. And I don't owe any of you anything anymore. We took you for granted, my mother blurted, the words rushed, panicked, almost angry, like she hated having to say them, like she knew they were the only way to make me reconsider, like she was willing to admit it just so she could undo everything that had happened. I closed my eyes, inhaled slowly. Let the words sit there between us. Let them exist for a moment. Let her feel them. Let her acknowledge what she had just said. And then, finally, after all this time, after years of watching him stay silent, after decades of letting my mother and my brother dictate the rules, my father's voice cut through the quiet. I should have spoken up sooner, he said, his tone carrying something I had never heard from him before, something that almost sounded like regret. I swallowed hard, something twisting in my chest, something tugging at me, something that made me want to ask him why, something that made me want to demand to know where he had been all these years, something that made me almost want to believe that maybe he meant it. But then I looked at my phone screen, at the incoming call from my bank, probably wondering if I wanted to update my information now that I wasn't paying for other people's mistakes anymore, and suddenly, I wasn't sure what to believe. Maybe I was finally getting through to them. Or maybe it was just another trick. Months passed, and the silence that had once felt foreign, once felt unnatural, once felt like something waiting to be broken, became something else entirely, something I had learned to embrace, something that felt right in a way I never expected. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for my phone to ring, wasn't anticipating another request, wasn't bracing myself for the next favor disguised as family obligation, wasn't carrying the weight of expectations that had never belonged to me in the first place. I woke up every morning with no messages demanding my attention, no guilt-ridden texts manipulating me into fixing things, no long-winded calls that started with "How are you?" and ended with "By the way, can you help me out?" And I was happy. Not the kind of happiness that comes with grand moments, not the kind of happiness that feels loud or obvious or declarative, but the kind of quiet, steady, unshakable happiness that settles deep in your bones when you realize you are no longer responsible for anyone else's messes. The kind of happiness that comes when you sit down to dinner, knowing the only person you need to take care of is yourself. The kind of happiness that lingers when you check your bank account and see your money, untouched, unclaimed, belonging only to you. I had spent so many years carrying them, so many years giving without hesitation, so many years believing that love was measured in how much you were willing to sacrifice for the people around you. But now, sitting in the home I had made for myself, surrounded by things that were mine, supported by a life I had built without anyone else's input, I realized that love, real love, was not about giving until you had nothing left. It was about knowing when to stop. I didn't hear much from my family during those months, only the occasional cold attempt from my mother to pretend nothing had happened, the short, stiff text messages that said, "Hope you're doing well," but never included an apology, never acknowledged the truth, never indicated any real understanding of why I had walked away in the first place. My brother stayed silent, likely too embarrassed to reach out after his last desperate attempt to manipulate me into bailing him out. And my father, as always, remained in the background, still the quiet observer, still too hesitant to pick a side, still watching from a distance as the family he had let rot slowly began to fall apart. And then, one evening, as I sat curled up on my couch with a glass of wine, my laptop open in front of me, an email notification popped up at the corner of my screen. My mother's name. No subject line. No lengthy message. Just one sentence, sitting there in the body of the email, simple and straightforward, as if it was the easiest thing in the world, as if everything that had happened could be undone with just a few words, as if time had not passed, as if wounds had not been carved into places that could never be healed. "We miss you. Come to dinner, it's on us." I stared at the screen, rereading the message over and over, waiting for something to change, waiting for another sentence to appear, waiting for a sign that this was something real instead of just another calculated attempt to pull me back in. I could picture her sitting at her laptop, typing those words with careful precision, knowing exactly what she was doing, knowing exactly how to make it sound like an invitation, knowing exactly how to make it feel like something harmless, something simple, something that could undo everything if I just let it. I thought about all the years I had jumped at invitations like this, all the times I had set aside my own feelings, all the times I had convinced myself that this time would be different, that this time they would see me, that this time they would appreciate me, that this time it wouldn't end the same way it always did. But this time I knew better. I hovered my cursor over the reply button, debating whether or not to say something, debating whether or not to respond, debating whether or not to give them the closure they had never given me. But then, with a slow breath, I moved my mouse instead to the small trash can icon at the top of the screen, my fingers steady, my heart calm, my decision already made before I even clicked. Delete. No response. No explanation. No second chances. Because maybe they meant it this time, maybe they truly had changed, maybe they had finally learned something from my absence. Maybe.
But now?
Now it was too late.